Hello and welcome to another late night talk. My guest this evening is James Logan. Hi, James. How are you? How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, it's Friday. I'm counting down the hours till it's gin o'clock. We're not quite there, but it's
Well,
the clock is inching closer, and yeah, no. So
somewhere it is, gin o'clock, I think.
I should point out I'm not working today, which is why
Of course, yes.
I'm not. It's not like I'm supposed to be, like editing and doing something or other. So
No, that'll do.
you know.
It's fine. Go.
So yeah, no, but it's all yeah, doing well, thanks. Yeah, how are
Good.
yourself? You all right?
Yes, like you, busy with a billion things and pulls on our time, but it's all part of the game.
It is.
Um, so let's go back. Let's go back in time in the time machine and talk about your childhood. What kind of things were you reading? What was inspiring you as a kid? What got you into sci-fi and fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, all kinds of things actually across different mediums. Books were obviously a major part of my childhood, and my parents would take me to the library every week, and I just get a bunch of books out and power through them, and then repeat, rinse, repeat kind of thing. And
Yes.
all sorts of, I can't really remember any specific titles. This is a long time ago now, but that was clearly where the initial love of reading was formed, I think, and love of the written word. But also played video games from a very early age. I think like 5 or 6. Got my randomly just asked for a computer for Christmas. I don't know why or where that came from, but the idea is kids just suddenly get in their heads that they want
Yeah.
something with absolutely no kind of rationale. It was just like, I want a computer. So bet my dad was thrilled when that went on the Christmas list that year. But Santa was very obliging, and I got my Commodore 64, which is an absolute classic, a banger of a
Yes.
machine.
Hmm.
Like certain people of a certain age just get slightly misty-eyed when you mention the Commodore 64 because it was a great machine. And yeah, the halcyon days of going to WH Smith's and like you could buy like a Commodore game for like £4. It is just
Hmm.
magical kind of wonderland of just going in and seeing all these cassettes on the shelf. And but yeah, so I played a load of video games, and this was quite early in terms of the gestation of video games and the development of them. I mean, this would have been sort of like the mid to late 80s, so
Yeah.
still pretty primitive at that point, but and very much based like they were. I don't think games at that point had necessarily become a kind of a medium for storytelling as such. They were more kind of like
No.
platform games, and you know. So there was a lot of side scrollers and a lot of jumping around and shooting things, but not a huge amount of storytelling being done. But that was very, I think, a lot of these worlds that these games were set in were obviously fantastical or science fictional. I think again
Mm.
that kind of was feeding in. Even if I didn't realize it, I think that was slowly feeding in. But also just growing up watching 80s cartoons. I mean, it's almost impossible to watch all of those kind of cartoons and not be into fantasy and science fictional. I mean, you had He-Man and Thundercats and Ghostbusters and Transformers, Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles.
Dungeons and Dragons with
Yeah,
the
yeah, Dungeons and
yeah.
Dragons. Yeah, and all of these fantastical things. And it's always, I feel like it's almost impossible to kind of watch those and not just somehow just be completely converted to. I always remember China Mieville saying actually that in some random interview I read with him, like that people used to ask him, "Oh, how did you get into like monsters and stuff?" And his response to that was, how did you get out of it? Like, and I kind of understand that
Yeah.
because I think look, kids tend to love monsters and scary things, don't they? And
Yeah.
so I just kind of grew up with all of those cartoons. I think Transformers in particular was like a real favorite, and my parents got me the animated film, the 1986 animated film.
Hmm.
With Orson Welles doing the Unicron voice, and like that was I think that was a fundamental thing for me. I became hooked on that, and I must have watched that film hundreds of times, and it still remains one of my absolute favorite films. But like that, I mean, is incredible because unlike a lot of the Transformers stuff that came later, it really mines the lore really deeply,
Hmm.
and it really you get there's so much in there. I mean, it's about a robot planet that goes around eating other planets. I mean, it doesn't really get much bigger than that, does it? Like when you think about scale and scope, that's about as big as it gets. And but like it's just watching that as like a 6-year-old or 7-year-old, like it's incredibly imaginative imaginative, and I still think the animation I still think is like, it holds up today. It was so ahead of its time. And also, like, you know, the soundtrack, Stan Bush with his mullet and the kind of guitar, incredible. Like, you know,
80s mullets, yeah.
80s mullets and 80s like power metal or whatever, and it's just, you know,
Yes.
progressive rock or whatever, and like it's impossible to watch that and not be moved on some level. Like, but you know, so I think that was where the kind of love of fantasy and science fiction kind of, I think, started to sink its claws in. But the kind of real moment was, I think there were two kind of literary moments that kind of really hooked me into kind of, you know, fantasy as in literary form. And the first of them was the Tim and the Hidden People series by Sheila McCullough, which
Right.
is something of a kind of has become kind of a cult sort of classic. And there's a really quite strong obsessive kind of fan base out there. I mean, it was basically a series of kids reading books, and you know how they work. There's like four different series, and each one gets progressively harder to read because they're for older kids each time. You know,
Mm.
um, and the later ones like have fewer pictures in, which automatically makes them less attractive to a kid, I think. But like these were incredibly imaginative stories. I can't say imaginative today. It's just not quite
Friday.
happening.
It's a Friday day, you
It's
know.
the second time I've reached for it. It's just both times it's not quite
no,
come
leave
off.
it. Leave it.
Let's just leave it. But yeah, just wonderfully creative. Stories about like a young boy who finds a magic key, and the magic key enables him to see the hidden people, who are these kind of like Napoleonic era style kind of characters that live in the Hollow Hill out in the woods or whatever. And there's good hidden people and there's bad hidden people, and there's like witches and there's kind of monsters and all this kind of stuff. And so the storytelling was just wonderful, but also the illustrations, I think by Pat Cook, I want to say, the illustrations were just incredibly evocative and atmospheric. And my mum was a teacher, and so she had the full set. It's a shame we don't still have the full set, because it's worth a damn lot on eBay, I'll tell you that much. But
Mm.
I remember her sort of just pottering around cleaning up the classroom, and I'd be just completely engrossed in these books because, you know, so that, I think that's the first moment I remember reading something fantastical and just being completely immersed in it. That's the first sort of case zero, as it were, or whatever you call it. Patient zero or whatever. But then the real kind of fundamental point, I think, for me, and this is like one of those sliding doors moments, where I can see my life maybe have gone very differently if this kind of hadn't happened,
Right.
was I don't know if you remember, because I mean, we're sort of a similar age, I think, and so I don't know if you remember, but we used to have like Puffin Book Club at school, and
Yeah.
you get the little leaflet, and it had a little catalogue, and it had all the books in it, and you
Yep.
would kind of bring your money in and your order form, and you give it in, and then 2 weeks later the books would turn up. It was pretty awesome. But I remember one time there was Return to Firetop Mountain, fighting fantasy book, the 50th one in the series was on there. And I don't know why, but for some reason I honed in on that book and I decided I wanted it. And
Jackson and Livingstone.
yeah, that's
Green
exactly, yeah.
spines.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
The
yeah.
iconic green spines. But for some reason I decided I wanted that book, and so I got it, and that was it. I was just, you know, and again, the link it has with Tim and the Hidden People is the great illustrations. Like, it was Martin McKenna that did the illustrations for that book, and incredible illustrations that immediately just pulled me in. And that really for me was like the starting point. Like, I was in this fantasy world, I was the hero, because that was the whole point of the book. It was like, it literally says you are the hero on it. And it was like, you know, it was obviously one of these like it's kind of like choose your own adventure type stuff, you know. Go to page 5 if you want to do this, or go to page 20 if you want to do that. And that, you know, that for me was just like, I was just hooked after that. Like, being in this fantasy world with these monsters, these incredible illustrations, and me getting to decide what happened was just something just really clicked for me. And so I just ended up devouring a lot of that series, and I have the whole series now, like, downstairs. You know, I ended up collecting the entire lot. But that for me was like the fundamental moment when I think I got hooked on epic kind of heroic fantasy, and the idea of these worlds. And, you know, spent many happy hours rolling dice and, you know, doing that thing where you kind of insert multiple fingers throughout the book because you want to check that you're
To
not
check.
gonna
No,
just to,
no,
you know,
okay.
it's definitely not cheating, you know.
It's
And
not. No.
you know, and
No.
rolling die, you know, dice or whatever for you to do your attributes, and like
Mhm.
rolling a 1 and then just kind of pretending it didn't happen and
I
rolling it
fell off the
again. It's like,
table. You
oh,
got to roll it
you know,
again.
yeah, got exactly. So, but they were, you know, those were really kind of great memories. But that's where it started for me in terms of fantasy. I think that's where it kind of all began. And then from there, kind of progressed on to, adult, what I suppose what at the time was adult fantasy. But a friend of mine just who was kind of in, yeah, about the only friend I think I had at the time that was really into the same kind of stuff as I was. And he just gave me well I think he just recommended one day. He said, oh, there's this book I've got called Sword of Shannara, and I think you really like it. And so I had a family holiday coming up, and like the kind of daunting prospect of spending 2 weeks on holiday with my family, which, when you're a kind of sort of 14, 15-year-old who really just wants to be at home playing video games or whatever, the thought of going away for 2 weeks and being in a camper van or whatever the hell you're doing is kind of daunting. So I picked up Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks, and powered through that in about 2.5 days, which was quite
Wow,
impressive because
that's
it's
a
a big
big ass
book. It's a
book.
big book, but
Yeah.
I think it's testament to just how much I connected with it. I still remember like sitting, in the mobile home or whatever that we had, just being completely enraptured in that book, and that was it. Then I was sort of through the looking glass at that point. I think fighting fantasy kind of like brought me up to this kind of the border of it, and kind of said, doesn't this look interesting? And then sort of Shannara just kind of like smacked me over the head and sent me hurtling through this kind of, through the mirror. And then I've been on the other side ever since. And so and then obviously from there it was kind of going on to all the other kind of authors at the time. And of course, the 90s being what they were, it was mostly white male authors, writing these big fat epic fantasies. So from Terry Brooks, it went on to like Ray Feist and Robert Jordan and Ted Williams and all of these sort of all the authors in that kind of space that were writing these big kind of epic fantasies about farm boys kind of finding out that they're like the fifth cousin twice removed from some powerful mage or something, and so on and so forth. But I kind of lapped that stuff up. I was really into it, and that's kind of how. And at some point in that process, there was also kind of a minor obsession with Warhammer as well. I can't really remember at what point that started, but that was playing into it as well. And just being really immersed in all the kind of the lore and everything, and or fluff as I think they call it these days. But I'm old school, so I'll call it lore. But so that was that was a big influence as well. And weirdly, I don't know why, but like I've always been more into fantasy than science fiction, though I do really enjoy both. But I've always been more into fantasy. For some reason, when I went to Games Workshop for the first time, it was the Space Marines that I homed in on and ended up buying. And so I started collecting 40k rather than Warhammer, which to this day I have no idea why. There's a strange one. I don't quite
I don't know.
understand what was at work there. But
I think one of the reasons is when we were growing up, because you're about the same age, there was a lot more sci-fi on TV than there was fantasy. There's very little fantasy. And so in my brain, fantasy was, the books and the Warhammer painting the figures and D&D and all that kind of thing. But sci-fi was this thing on TV, and it just kind of felt a bit more remote. So I grew up watching, the Star Treks and the Babylon 5s and Battlestar Galacticas and all that kind of stuff, and right through to the present. It took until I was probably my early 30s before I actually actively started reading sci-fi alongside, because we didn't have, and we still don't have the same amount of fantasy on TV. It's creeping up, like Game of Thrones and everything else since, but it always just felt like fantasy was the book thing for me, and so it still kind of segments in my head, an 80-20 split, I think.
It's funny, isn't it, that it's a really interesting point about the science fiction on TV, because like fantasy in book world, fantasy has always kind of outsold science fiction. It's always kind of been the bigger than science fiction traditionally. But when you come to TV, it's the completely opposite way around, isn't it? When you think about all the science fiction TV shows like Babylon 5 and Battlestar Galactica, and like it just but fantasy, it feels sort of underrepresented, and it was only really with Lord of the Rings, I think that you had stuff before that, like
You did,
Willow
but
and stuff, but it
they were never good. They were never like, here's a 10-season thing, here's a 5-season arc of a show that was done all the way through. It was like, we'll try it, and then it didn't work. The fans aren't there, the technology isn't there.
And you had some. I just think, and this is going off on a bit of a tangent. You did have the odd fantasy film, and some of them are classics, albeit for entirely the wrong reasons. Like Hawk the Slayer, Krull,
Legend,
like
Princess
brilliant.
Bride.
Exactly. Well, exactly. I just think one of the things that I think is hard about fantasy on screen is so much of the time it just lacks the authenticity, and I think authenticity is what makes or breaks a series, a fantasy series for me. You have to feel like it just has to feel real, and a lot of the time I'm watching like a fantasy thing, and it doesn't have that realistic feel to it. It doesn't feel authentic, and it's nothing to do with like the fact that it's got monsters in it or anything like that. It's to do with just how it looks and just how it feels. I think one of the reasons Thrones did so well is because it did nail that. It did feel kind of authentic. It felt like a real world. It didn't feel like a set, you know. And I think that's so crucial, I think. And even something like Solomon Kane, which I do have a real soft spot for, and I do really like that film. But even at times, it just has a slight B movie feel about it, like with the costumes and stuff. It doesn't quite feel right, you know, somehow.
I
So
think the other thing is that with fantasy, if we get a character and they say this character's an orc, this character's a giant, this character's a troll, we just roll with it. Doing that
mm,
convincingly on TV,
mm,
even
mm,
Game of Thrones, you know, almost every person in the cast is human. I can't, you know, apart from you get the walkers and the odd giant, but then there are narrative points of view who are actually active participants. They're
mm,
villains or monsters, and that's okay. But that's why I think sci-fi usually does better. I mean, with Star Trek, he ended up with 47 aliens with a bit of plastic stuck somewhere slightly
yeah,
different to make a
yeah.
new race. But they're still
Mm,
mostly human. It wasn't until you got to the later series where they actually fleshed them out and you realized, okay, this is what a Vulcan is. This is what a
mm.
Klingon is. But doing that with fantasy effectively on TV, that requires a lot of heavy lifting, and most audiences just won't go with it. But if everyone looks human, it's a smaller hurdle for them to get in, I think. So
Yeah, it's amazing, really, like where we are now in terms of like all the Marvel films. Marvel's a funny one for me because I don't have the same connection to it that a lot of people have. Somehow, growing up, I just completely missed out on like comics.
comics.
Yeah, I don't know why. I remember playing Top Trumps in the school playgrounds with like Silver Surfer and like
Yes.
Hobgoblin and stuff, and like. And and I knew what they were. Like I got it. Like I understood it, but I never got into kind of, and I did read like comics at one point, but
Mm.
not Marvel. It was like really old episodes. There's a comic. It was like Dan Dare and stuff. God, that I'm
Yeah.
really showing my age now. And
Well,
to be honest, this was like a slightly previous generation. So these are comics that were in my mum's stock cupboard, like school stock cupboard, just sort of ended up in there. There's a whole bunch of them, and so they were like from slightly before. So it wasn't quite sort of our generation, I don't think. But yeah, I was sort of reading Eagle, which was like Dan Dare and all this kind
yeah.
of stuff. But somehow I never got into actual superheroes and Marvel comics and DC and stuff. So it means like sort of everyone's going wild, or maybe not so much these days, but like at one point everyone's obsessed with Marvel films. I'm just like, I have no sort of connection to this. I just don't have the connection that everyone else seems to have to it, which is
Mm.
maybe one reason why I'm just never really got into the films. But I don't know, it's a whole different kind of conversation. But
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like if they suddenly did a TV adaptation of your favorite fantasy series, some people are just tune into Game of Thrones, have no idea about any of it, and go, "Oh, this is quite good," and other
yeah,
people are losing their minds and stuff. But yeah, so you read Gemmell, didn't you, when you got to kind of a bit older in your 20s?
I did. Yeah, I did. Yeah, Gemmell was
Mm.
yeah. I think my brother read him first actually, and put me on to him. But yeah, Gemmell again was for some reason I always seem to forget when I'm talking about influences. I always seem to sort of forget about Gemmell. I think it was because I came to him a bit later, and so you kind of remember the stuff that you read when in the more formative phase, and then you have a tendency to maybe forget the stuff that came in the second wave, as it were. And Gemmell, I think for me was kind of more of a second wave author. But yeah, no, I really sort of got into his stuff in particular and just really smashed through all of that and loved that obviously. And yeah, it's always a source of regret that I never actually got to meet him at a kind of a signing or anything. And obviously he died in
Mm.
2006, which was just a real shock. But no, I loved his work, particularly the I mean, obviously the Draenei stuff is fabulous, but
Yeah,
I also really love the Regant series as well. Like,
yeah, yeah,
I honestly like some of the character work in that is. I need to go back and reread it because some of the character work is just extraordinary in that. Like the way it plays over the arc of the four books is just. I think he was so good at character and
yeah, yeah.
yeah, like
I
I
mean,
just yeah
we get huge fantasy books now, and I do read them, hence I've got tons on my shelf. But he could do so much with so little for characters,
yeah
and I
yeah
envy that, because sometimes I just want a 300-400 page burn through, quick, fun, pulp type story, and he could do that. He could do so much with so little. He's one of the few that I think mastered that. but yeah, he was. I met him once at one signing before he passed away, and that was it.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that was quite a moment for sure.
yeah. I mean, he was like, it was the kind of thing with Gemmell where the story, the actual plots he was using were fairly sort of formulaic and really quite repetitive. And I think, I'm sure he would be one of the first to acknowledge that. I think indeed he did probably acknowledge it at one point, but it doesn't really matter. Like you kind of knew where the story was going because it was the same story that you'd read at least a couple of times before. But because the characters are so good, it didn't matter. Like it drew you in every single time because the characters were just so just so much kind of, it's so engrossing and so much fun to spend time with. And he just had a real line on that sort of hard bitten kind of anti-hero with a dark past kind of character. I mean,
Mm,
I was thinking about Waylander the other day and
mm,
how the first scene, and I was thinking about this for another podcast I was doing, thinking about in the context of like kind of rogues and roguelike characters and why
yeah.
they're fun to write, why they're fun to read about. And the opening to Waylander just sprung to mind because it's just so brilliant the way it literally opens with him just walking into a kind of a clearing in the woods or whatever, and basically it's just taking out murdering the thieves who've stolen his horse. And then there's this poor priest who's just tied to a tree, and Waylander just leaves him there. Like he just gets his horse and he goes to leave, and the priest is like, "What? Wait, you've got to free me. You got to set me free." And to which Waylander responds, "Why?" And but I just thought that is so powerful in the context of the hero in fantasy stories. Like
Mm,
none of the books that I read in the 90s, like big epic fantasies, none of them had a character that would behave like that.
no.
So for this, the first scene in the book, for the protagonist of the book to kind of come out with that line and be like, why should I do that? Like it's a complete inversion of everything you expect from a sort of traditional fantasy hero. And I think that's
Mm,
maybe one of the reasons I connected with Gemmell. I think it's because the characters feel realistic. They just have more realism about them. I think they're more relatable. If it feels weird to be saying that about a kind of a person that murders people for a living and saying they're relatable, but like just a lot of these people were kind of had been broken and sort of ground down by
mm.
their life and by circumstance, and that to me is more relatable than some farm boy who
Yeah, it's
realizes
a
he's
secret
descendant of
destiny.
this and secret
Yeah.
destiny, and it's like there was something refreshing about it, I think, and that's one of the things I think makes his work sort of stand out. With Gemmell, it was interesting because I think his influences were actually westerns rather than sort of fantasies, and you can
And
kind of
crime
see
as
and
well,
crime, yeah,
because
and
he
you
was a
can kind of
journalist and he mixed with some really
yeah,
dark people, and all of
yeah.
that fed in.
It did, yeah. Well, he grew up in sort of East London.
London.
He
Yeah,
grew
yeah.
up in East London or whatever, and he's post-war, which is pretty, some quite hard
Rough.
deprivation. Still had oh gosh, I can't even, the word is escaping me, but rationing and stuff
Rationing.
like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So pretty hard world to grow up in, particularly as like the sort of in a single parent household, whatever. And I think, yeah, all that fed in. But like I think you can see the Western influences in a lot of his kind of fantasies because they do feel, instead of like I mean, obviously you've got the John Chano stuff, which are actually
They're
kind of weird
amazing.
westerns, which are fantastic. But even the Drenai stuff, like you're just substituting the kind of the lone gunman for the kind of lone swordsman, but the actual
Yeah.
kind of, and obviously it doesn't really have a Western aesthetic, but the actual story and the plot and the way it plays out and the type of character very much is rooted in the Western. And I think that maybe that's one of the reasons his kind of fiction really stood out for people, was because it was fantasy, it was heroic fantasy, but it very much just had a totally different feel to maybe a lot of the other things that were around at the time. And maybe perhaps that's what made it stand out. But also the fact that he was, as we just discussed, like a real master at character and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I know people jokingly say that Joe Abercrombie's Lord Grimdark, and he kind of that. I think he's basically that generation's Grimdark, but I think Gemmell was the one before him, and there were others before them that had
Yeah.
like dark characters who are thieves or villains or but I think Gemmell was the kind of 90s, early 2000s equivalent of Grimdark because they were broken people in extraordinary circumstances trying to just do their best, and he could do it
Mm.
in 400 pages. That might take someone 700 page
Yeah.
a trilogy books, and I'm like, Yeah, this guy was so good at lean prose.
He
It goes
was,
back
and
to
yeah,
journalism as well, I think.
I think yeah, it does. And learning to write in quite a clipped, kind of succinct way. And I remember him saying in an interview that he was having a conversation with like a writer friend or something, and this friend said, "Oh, if I'm writing a scene set in a room or whatever, I can't actually get to the action until I've described the room and what color the curtains are and all this." And to which Gemmell was like, "Oh, screw that! Just get to the point. Like, what get to the action, make something happen." And so I think yeah, you do see that in his writing. It is sparse, and he doesn't really waste time with like quite like big descriptive passages or anything. I think you can learn a lot, I think, from reading his work and seeing how to keep the kind of focus and momentum, and not get sidetracked into because I think it's something that you do, like I think something that certainly I did in sort of more formative years of writing was really going to town on these big descriptive passages, because I think that's in your mind. I think that's where you identify those descriptive bits as the chance to show off, or like just or you feel they're really important. I certainly kind of put more importance in those kind of big descriptive paragraphs than I think they deserve, actually. And obviously, I think for me it was learning to kind of that less is more, I think, when it comes to description, and actually learning the art of trying to get across what you need to describe in 2 or 3 sentences max, rather than writing a big, long, kind of florid paragraph. And I think it's one of the reasons there was a few authors that I kind of bumped off a little bit in my more formative years, simply because it was just so dense. It was so and I know a lot of people really enjoy that. A lot of readers
Well,
do
yeah.
really enjoy the dense. I think one thing, like Wheel of Time fans, for example, I think that the real hardcore Wheel of Time fans, I think, just love the denseness of the writing and the immersion and the world building details. But I you know sometimes struggle a little bit with that. It's all about pacing, though, isn't it? And there's
But the
so many other
books were
things that
coming
play
out
into
when
it.
we were still like when we were growing up, the books were still coming out, but the gaps between the books were kind of like 2 years and then 3 years and then 3 years. So I was having to like go back and read them from the start again every
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
By the time I got to like the eighth or ninth book, I'm like, I can't do this anymore. So I stopped at,
yeah.
I don't know, nine maybe. I still never finished it. I'm like, I can't
Mm.
go back and read 14 books.
Yeah, yeah,
Sanderson did the last two, three after
yeah, yeah.
Jordan passed and nominated him. But I'm like, at this stage, there's no way I can go back and read 14 books, like
It's
just to
tough,
find out
isn't
the
it? Yeah,
ending.
it's funny. Like, one of the things I struggle with as an adult is I just do not have the attention span that I had. Like when I was a kid, I would sit there and I would read for hours and just barely
Hours.
barely look up. Yeah, just hours, just read and read and read for hours and barely even look up. And now I'll read for, like, even if I'm reading something I'm really enjoying, I'll read for like a few minutes and then sort of be distracted by something. It's really hard to kind of feel. Fortunately, I don't have that problem when I'm writing. I can absolutely Writing is actually the only time I can really deeply focus on something for a
Mm.
long period of time without looking away from it and doing something else. Everything else, like I really have to kind of force myself to concentrate. As attention span is just completely gone, and I don't know whether
Changed.
like that's an age thing or whether who knows. But yeah, it's a challenge for all of us, I think, particularly
Oh yeah.
particularly sort of the younger generations that never had it to begin with, because they've grown up with with smartphones and goodness
Phones
knows
from day
what and
one.
stuff like that, and it's
Yeah.
a totally different kind of ball game for them, I think. But
We're old enough to remember the world before the internet, and
yeah,
those
yeah.
who aren't old enough kind of struggle to imagine what we did all day.
I know. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Read
Like,
books
well, what do you
for
do?
one.
Play in the
Like,
mud a bit, but
yeah,
not just
yeah,
like all day every day.
yeah. But I mean, I know it's kind of as if, like, video games didn't exist or something.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you
I
know,
live by the seaside. I went to the arcades all the time and played games like every fucking
yeah,
week down the arcades playing games. You know.
yeah.
So when did you start writing? When did you start taking it seriously and thinking, I want to write a book?
I mean, yes. There's I think, well, the first time I actually started writing, there's kind of two answers to this question, but I started writing when I was about 15, 16,
Hmm.
and it my kind of first love, really creatively, wasn't writing, it was music. I was super into music when I was a teenager. That was, along with football and video games and books, I think music was my kind of one of my early sort of loves and passions. And So I was in a band for quite a few years, and we played gigs and we made recordings and had a huge amount of fun doing it. And you know, because I was young and foolish, I kind of just assumed that, well, this obviously means we're going to be rock stars and I'm just going to be famous. And yeah, just you believe in it the way only kind of a teenager can believe in it.
Yeah.
And obviously completely ludicrous looking at it now, but I was 16 and so yeah, that obviously
It happens though. It does happen. Like some of the like breakouts that have done it, start in
yeah.
pubs and then they get discovered. And what's the Scottish lad called? Oh, I forgot his name, but he's
Lewis,
a
Lewis,
yeah,
Lewis
Lewis,
Capaldi.
just
Yeah,
singing and stuff, and then now he's gone from like
yeah,
galactic, and
yeah,
it's like
yeah,
what?
yeah. It's exactly.
Yeah.
I think the fact that we weren't very good probably didn't help. I don't know. Like, we were fine. I
Big
thought we
dreams.
were. I thought we were. In retrospectively, I've looked back and thought we were actually pretty good for our age. And now I'm like watching like 11-year-olds on YouTube doing these ridiculous guitar solos, and I'm just like, actually, maybe we weren't that good,
Well,
But the thing is, it's totally different. Like, if you're growing up now, you have guitar tutorials on YouTube, and you can
yeah,
watch your favorite bands on YouTube, and you can learn it by watching the videos. Whereas when I was growing up, like you you had to learn it by ear by listening to the record and then trying to figure it out. That was the only way of really doing it, unless you were
yeah,
lucky enough to see the video on MTV or something and record it so you could watch it back. And even then, you didn't, because it was like a music video rather than a kind of live performance video. It hardly ever showed the band playing anyway. So it was almost so. It was much more difficult back then. But anyway, that's a completely different topic. But yeah, I think so. I think at some point, I realized with the band that we weren't going to suddenly become world famous and become millionaires, and I was probably going to have to go to university instead, which is a bit of a crushing disappointment, but there we are. But it was kind of around that time, and there was a bit of crossover because I was very much into writing, into the idea of writing before the music side actually stopped. There was a little bit of crossover, but once the music kind of stopped, that was where the focus switched to writing. And it wasn't a conscious thing. It wasn't like I was like, oh, okay, I'm not doing music anymore, because I was the main songwriter. I was spending a lot of time writing the songs and music and so on, and some just absolutely terrible lyrics that were mostly stolen from other bands and things, because that's what you do, isn't it? But yeah, so it wasn't a conscious case of me deciding, well, I need a new creative outlet and I'm not doing music anymore, so I'll do writing instead. But so it wasn't a conscious decision, but I think on a subconscious level, that is kind of maybe how it worked. I think my subconscious was like, oh no, he's not playing music anymore. We need to distract him with something. Otherwise, goodness knows what's going to happen. Let's just make him do some writing. So regardless, whatever happened, that was when I started focusing on writing. And when I finished school and went to sixth form college, and it just so happened that we live around the corner from the college. So I, rather than what all the other kids had to do, which was basically come in and spend the whole day sort of kicking their heels around college waiting for their classes, I could go sort of into college for my class and then to come home again. So as a result, I spent quite a lot of time knocking about the house, with nothing to do. And that was when I started writing kind of properly, I think, when I really started sort of taking it a bit more seriously. But even then, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of I wasn't thinking about it in terms of craft at all. I wasn't thinking about it in terms of like a potential career or something. I was just thinking, oh, it would be cool to write a book.
Hmm.
And I clearly had learned nothing from my failed pop star, rock star dreams, because I went into the writing with the same ludicrous self-confidence that I had with the music. So clearly lessons had not been learned. I remember saying to a friend, just incredibly cockily, I vividly remember being in his kitchen and just kind of saying, but I could write a fantasy novel. I bet I could do it really well, which is just ridiculous when you think about it now. But in a way, having that kind of over the top confidence was really helpful, because it meant I just dived straight in without thinking about it. I didn't kind of sit there thinking, oh, this is intimidating. Should I be doing this at all? I just sort of barreled straight in and just, and I think that was really helpful, I think, in terms of just getting started. But yeah, I spent a lot of time writing, and like I had no idea what I was doing, but the one thing I knew was that I enjoyed it. I really
Yeah.
enjoyed being in front of the screen. I've always been quite a bit of an introvert, and so I was used to spending a lot of time on my own. And so being in front of the screen on my own for hours on end, immersed in this world, was absolutely not unusual for me at all. So I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but I did know that I liked it, and that was where I think the kind of the writing sort of originated. And so I guess for like the next sort of year or two while I was at sixth form college, I was just writing endless first chapters and always finding an excuse, you know, a bit like how you're playing a video game and you kind of get what people call restart-itis, where you just want to keep
Right.
restarting as a different character or whatever. You're playing as a rogue and you're kind of like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I was a wizard or whatever, and you restart. It was kind of a bit like that. I sort of I write a couple of chapters and they'd be like, but what if, you know, and then go back and start over. And so that when that happened, that kind of went on for a few years, and obviously I went to university and didn't get much writing done at all because I had better things to be doing. And you know, I'd love to say that I didn't do any writing because I was busy partying and stuff, but really I was just probably holed up playing Baldur's Gate 2 or something in my room, you know, Championship Manager or something. I did have one novel attempt during those years, which obviously just hit the buffers after about 20,000 words or something. So that was that. And then it was a few years later, and I think it was around 2007, 2008 when that was when I kind of came back to it properly, and I started having another go, and wasn't at a great point in my life at that stage, and I feel like I needed something to distract me, and so that's maybe why I kind of returned to it. But the writing was always something; it never went away. It was always there in the background. Even when I wasn't writing, I was always thinking about the idea of writing, and always, you know, really had the dream of writing a book. And but you know, never learn the lesson, which I think is really important, of like finishing what you start. And I think that's a really important piece of it. There's a lot of, I mean, we can maybe talk about this a bit later in more detail, but I think there's a lot of writing advice out there, which is just really terrible advice. But I think, but I think the kind of finish what you start, I think, is absolutely valuable advice, which I would sort of offer up to anyone. I got really good over the years. I got really good at writing the opening to novels. I had no practice at writing anything past the kind of 40,000 word mark. So, you know, it's not ideal to be really great at like writing a third of a novel and having no experience whatsoever at writing the rest, you know. So I think learning to finish what you start and getting used to the entire process of writing a start and a middle and an end, and the character arcs and the plots and all that kind of stuff, you know, I think is really invaluable. And it's almost maybe why it's good to start with short stories, because you can do it in kind of like miniature almost. You get used to that three act structure, get used to kind of seeing a project through, get used to the structure, get used to the arcs and how they, you know, the fact that you need to have an arc of some kind, and just get used to these kind of basic writing elements, which I had no education in whatsoever because I never got progressed that far. So I was never able to kind of learn these things. So yeah, that, you know, that continued for many years, and I think it was sort of just on and off writing like so many abandoned manuscripts that got dropped about 30 or 40,000 words in because for whatever reason I'd always find an excuse, you know. Not you know, I remember one time I got halfway through one and was like, character's just rubbish, it's not, I don't like the main character. And it's like, what I should have done is just keep going. It's like, okay, well, we can refine the character on subsequent drafts, let's not worry about, let's keep going. But of course I just restarted instead, and you know, so it was like that for many years, and then it was finally in 2015. God, I just forget what year it is these days.
It's difficult.
Sometimes I do have to stop and think about what year it is, and I think the pandemic didn't help because that
we need to reset to just kind of like before pandemic and after pandemic. But one thing I'll say is during this period, I know the answer to this, but I think events and attending events, if possible, in person, now you can do them online, is very important. I always say to writers, I know that you were going to events, listening to authors, editors, agents talking.
I remember meeting you at Edge Lit in Derby,
because this is where we met for the first time.
And I think that must have been I want to say like 2009 or 10, I think, something like that probably. But I vividly remember our kind of, you know, first conversation. I think I knew you from Twitter or something, or from the online scene, because there was a certain sort of online, sort of burgeoning online scene in those days. But no, you're right, going to things like that and being able to meet other writers and authors and listen to them talk, I think was really invaluable, I think. So I think now, again, this is kind of like linking into what we were talking about earlier, when like if you want to learn music, there's all manner of material available for you for free at the click of a mouse. Whereas you know, back when you and I were probably starting to write, the internet was kind of, it existed, but it was just so embryonic at that point. And you know, the amount of resources that are available now like if you want to find out how do I get an agent, you can go and Google that, and there are hundreds of videos of authors talking about it. There's agents talking about it. If you bothered to put the work in, you can get a very good idea of what you need to do and how to do it
Yeah.
reasonably quickly without that much effort. Whereas 20 years ago, like who did you ask? Like, and it was so much more difficult to kind of know what to do and find out these kind of routes and things. And it was the same for writing as well. As hence why when I just jumped in, I had no idea what I was doing, and I couldn't really just there were no resources available, so
No.
you just kind of did it. It was like, so I'm kind of almost as a writer almost entirely self-taught, as it were, because I've never done like a writing course. I've never read a book about how to write. I just kept doing it and doing it over and over again until I went from being terrible to being slightly less terrible, and then being sort of mediocre, and then to wherever I am today. And I'll leave that for readers to decide. It's not really for me to decide, but yeah, it's a different world now. And but in a way, I think there was a lot to be said for just kind of learning as you went. And because I think also, I suppose the downside of having all the material available is it's easy to adopt the mindset of, oh, I'm not going to write my start writing until I've like watched every tutorial video and every this and every that. And it's like there's a point where you just need to take the first step and actually just start writing. And
Yeah.
because I just plowed straight in, I do think that that on some level I think that was quite beneficial in terms of learning the ropes and just not hamstringing myself by being kind of reluctant and feeling like I need to do more research or do more of this or do more of that. I think there's something to be said for that, really.
You can make mistakes and then you work stuff out. And then if you're not sure, you can then find the resources now. Whereas back then we didn't have it. I'd write a
Yeah.
book, realize it was terrible, try and fix it, couldn't go anywhere, went on to the next one, and that was kind of how it was. And
Yeah.
it's the same, I think, with world building. I met one guy once and he says, oh, I've been world building for 5 years, I'll be ready to start writing soon. And I'd be
Bloody
like,
hell, wow.
why? What's wrong
Yeah,
with, like,
yeah.
when people ask me, I'm like, if you've done world building for longer than a year, I'm saying that's it now, stop whatever you're doing, the rest will come as you're writing through the story.
God,
Like,
I
but
would
what if
just
I need,
yeah.
I'm like, no,
No,
write the
no.
story,
I
just
would
get on
just
with it.
I think I would just get bored if I'd been world building for 5 years.
It's fun, but
I
it's
would
not
just get bored.
writing.
I mean, I did that whole thing of going to coffee shops and doing the whole kind of like, I'm a writer, I'm going to sit here with my notebook, and I did that for a few months, actually doing kind of world building, and that was just kind of thinking about the world that I wanted to kind of this is when I was wanting to write Silverblood. This was thinking about the world that it was going to be in, and so I did do that kind of thing of world building and writing down loads of notes and stuff. But I only did it for a few months, and then by that point I was like, I think I know what I'm doing. Like I've got
Have
a
a go
vague
now.
idea.
Have a
Like
go.
you go. I think a lot of for me a lot of I think to some extent writing is an organic process, and so much kind of grows while you're writing, and
Mm.
there's only I think there's only so much that you can really think of in advance. And I think obviously I think it really does help to have a really solid idea of the setting and the wider world and certain things and how they work, because I know when I was writing the first draft of Silverblood, I was very much kind of like, don't know how this works. I'll figure it out as I go. And then guess what? I didn't figure it out as I go, and then had like a million things to then have to figure out later. So there's definitely stuff that is helpful to figure out in advance and stuff. So that yeah, you do want to spend some time doing that world building, I think.
Mm.
But there's also once you've got a basic idea, and I think that point you've just got to jump in and just run with it and let the rest of it just kind of evolve naturally. Because otherwise you'll do what that fella did, and you'll just spend years just kind of skirting around the edges of actually writing a book without actually writing it. And I think you just at some point you've just got to say, okay, enough's enough. I'm just gonna I've done my prep and let's just see how it goes, kind of thing.
World building's fun. World building's basically like D&D. You're just creating an adventure for someone potentially to go into for players, but
Mm,
you're never actually
mm,
doing the story. But
mm.
it's fun, but it's not writing. So after all of these half-hearted, start stops
Mm,
and not
mm.
finishing, what was different about the Silverblood that made you, after 30-40K, keep going and finish the draft?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a sense of I'd had the dream of writing a book for many years, and obviously I moved into publishing in 2010 when I joined Orbit,
Mm.
and became a professional editor and was working on the editorial side, and doing all of that. 'Cause I guess I figured that editing books was the second best thing to actually writing them. Moved into publishing, and I think I went through a phase of not writing because I don't know. I think I felt a bit weird about writing a book when I was actually in the industry or something. I felt like it was a dirty secret, and it didn't feel quite right or something. And then, of course, you learn that pretty much everyone in publishing is also writing a novel, so it's like completely normal. So but I think I got to. I think it was 2015, or it would have been 2014 actually. But I think I just got to the point where I was thinking it's time to put up or shut up with this, because I've had this dream of writing a book for so long. I've bored all my family to death talking about it, and I think I didn't want to be one of those people that talked a good game but never actually followed through on it, because I think we've all met them, and I've worked with a lot of them in the past, like in previous jobs, where there's always someone who's like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, but you go back 5 years later and they're still working in the same place doing the same job, and they never did do the thing they always said they were going to do. I didn't want to be one of those people. I wanted to actually do this. I think around in 2014, I finally decided that I need to kind of put up or shut up here. Like it's time to deliver on this, or just give up on it, because there's only so long you can go with just thinking, oh, one day I'm going to ... And
we've been talking about it for years. We've been going to events for years by that point. Seeing other writers do it, and I'm like,
you feel, and you feel like it's time to see whether I can actually do this. I wanted to answer the question of, can I actually write a book, and if so, what will happen? It was kind of a source of kind of anxiety to me that I might never answer that question. So anyway, I decided that 2015 was going to be the year that I did it. And I also kind of struck a deal with myself where I kind of basically blew a load of money, which I didn't really have, but I blew a load of money on like a new Mac, desktop Mac, iMac, and but the deal was, if I buy this really expensive machine, I need to write a damn book. So that was when I started. January 2015, I started writing, the first words of the very first draft, and I think what I mean, to go back to your question of like what helped me push past the sort of 30,000-40,000 point, I think it was just that need to do it, the fear of abandoning yet another like manuscript. I just felt like I needed to, so I just kept going, like whereas previously I might have just abandoned it. I just kept pushing, and I knew there were things with it that weren't right. I knew that some of it was rubbish. The original opening is terrible when I think about it now, but I just kept going. I finally learned that lesson that you just got to push through. Like you just have to push through and ignore the voice that's going, this is rubbish, you're rubbish, what are you doing? You just got to keep going. And so I did, and I wrote 100,000 words that year. And I remember thinking at the end of the year, wow, I'm aiming for 150. I've done 100 in a year. That means 50 will take me another 6 months. So I'll have a first draft by mid 2016. Brilliant. Yeah, that's not what happened. Thus did I run swiftly and surely to my doom. For some reason, in the second year, I only wrote 50,000 words the entire year, and then realized at the end of that, I was still 50,000 words short of finishing the damn book. And then wrote another 50,000 words the year following that. And so finally, so 16, 17, 18, I think it was early 2019 when I finally crawled over the finish line, with the book kind of coming in at about 200,000, this lumbering, unwieldy 200,000 word monster finally just collapsing over the finish line. And then so it was 3 years or so to kind of get that first draft, and then another 2 to rework it into something that actually was felt like a book that actually worked, And I think one of the problems with it was, the irony is we talk about pantsers and plotters, and I'm very much in the latter camp, though the problem with that kind of question and that kind of conversation is it assumes like a binary position, and actually I think most writers are, it's a scale, and most writers are somewhere between the two, a little bit of one, even if it's like 90% one, 10% the other. I'm probably about 70-80% plotter, but I'm also 20% kind of make it up as we go. But with Silverblood, I had an idea of how the first third of the book went. I kind of knew what the main kind of, I had a rough idea of what the story was. I knew how the first third went, and I kind of thought, let's just do this. And so jumped into it. And then of course I got up to the point where I knew what happened, and then had to stop because I had no idea what I was doing, and then had to spend like several weeks figuring out a plot, and then quite a while later I had to do the same thing again for the final act. I had to again spend like 2 weeks kind of plotting it out and figuring it all out. So there was a certain amount of, I think that's one of the reasons it took me so long to write, was partly I was figuring out my process. I mean, Silverblood is the only book I've ever written all the way through, which
Wow.
is
Okay.
probably quite unusual for a debut author, for that to be
Yeah.
my debut novel that gets published. But that is the only book I've ever written all the way through. But because I didn't know my craft, I hadn't figured out my craft. That's one of the reasons it took so long. And I think the other reason it took so long was just I just hadn't really thought. I hadn't figured the plot out, and had to keep rewriting it to make certain things work and line up. And so there's an awful lot of rewriting going on. And by the time, I must have done 11 or 12 passes on that book altogether.
Wow.
I'm not even sure if that includes like copy edits, but yeah, a lot of pass. I mean, it's kind of a miracle I haven't got bored of it. I don't know how I've not, I've somehow managed to not get tired of it. But I mean, I would be happy never have to read the damn thing again, but I probably will have to at some point. But
Yeah, oh, yeah. You will.
But yeah, so basically, sort of, it was 5 or 6 years to get me to the point where I felt like I'm ready to, get an agent and start thinking about actually sending it out. And it was quite a serendipitous kind of moment. And I think sort of publishing for me just seems to be full of these moments when just a door opens and you kind of go through it, and it turns out to be rather fortunate, and it just feels like things are lining up. And I feel like, and this is a wider conversation, but I really do feel like so much success in publishing is down to kind of timing and the right thing at the right time, and certain things just aligning. And I think it explains why some books that maybe aren't particularly good are super popular, and some books that are brilliant just never quite find the audience they deserve. So much of it is about these elements lining up or not lining up, and there's only so much control you have over that. And so there is, and I really do believe that like luck is like what happens when hard work meets opportunity. But at the same time, you are quite powerless a lot of the time, and you're just relying on certain things to kind of line up for you. And it's just the kind of the nature. And I think it's the same in any creative endeavor. I think I've seen musicians talking about this as well, like really successful musicians saying, I knew loads of bands that were around the same time that we were, that were just as good, if not better than us, but they didn't get that lucky break that we did. And that's the only reason that we are now a multi-platinum band and they are not. It's just that lucky break. It didn't quite line up. They didn't quite get that moment they needed. It's the same in publishing. It's the same in music. And I imagine it's the same in like film and TV as well, for actors as well. Like you get the role and that, suddenly it opens up doors. So, but the kind of moment for me was, Silverblood was kind of done, and I was ready to start thinking about agents. And it was just at that point that my good friend Anne Perry, who had previously been an editor, had gone on maternity leave and was coming back, and had decided she wanted to move into agenting. And she just called me up and was like, "Hey, I know you're working on something. I'm now an agent. Do you want me to send it? Would you like to send me your book?" So, I mean, that was pretty fortunate, because I was literally just at the point where I started to think about, well, which agents do I send this to? So, of course, I was like, yeah, sure, I'll send it to you. So Anne read it and loved it. And about a couple of weeks later, I was, signed with her, and she was my agent. And so that all worked out incredibly well. And you like to think it was a sign of things to come, and it wasn't, at least not immediately. It wasn't. But we then spent kind of well, first of all, we did some more rewrites on the book, and I still don't remember the moment when Anne said that I need to take out 40,000 words, which was a great moment. We ended up stripping out one of the entire kind of POVs and subplots, which was fine as rewrites go, because it was mostly just deleting stuff rather than having to add stuff in. So it was, it wasn't, and because it was a totally separate kind of storyline up to a point, I just literally just stripped the chapters out and didn't really need to touch anything else. The problem was the character who was the POV comes into the book in the third act, and the problem I then had was, in the original draft, by the time the two storylines come together, we know exactly who this person is, because we've seen her backstory and what she's been doing. I now had the challenge of having to basically introduce her, because she was still a major character and had to be a major character that played a pivotal role. The trouble was, now no one knew who the hell she was. So the challenge then was like, exactly, yeah. So the challenge then It was tough, yeah. And the challenge then was like, how do I rewrite, insert these references to this character so that when she pops up, people are going to know who she is, and actually it'll have some relevance to them. And
Mm.
obviously, then having to rewrite the character's backstory to fit the new structure. I took 2 or 3 attempts, and I still realised that the version we went out on sub with, I thought it worked, and I read it sometime later and was like, wow, it doesn't actually work. That's not
Oh,
ideal. So I had to rewrite it again. But yeah, no, we so there was yet more work done on it, and then we went out on submission, and this was around 2021, so it was still pandemic
oof,
era,
pandemic.
so it was
Yeah.
tough. I think by that point, editors, everyone was just a bit frazzled by that point, and I know in publishing there was a lot of just burnout and just people finding it hard, as everyone was, obviously, all across the country and the world. So it was an interesting time to be going out on submission, and it was also tricky because I think that it just so, and this links back to talking about things lining up and things happening at the right time. We definitely didn't go on sub at the right time, because I think at that moment in time, fantasy was moving away from kind of, it had its grimdark moment. Not that
Mm.
Silverblood I think is grimdark by any stretch of the imagination, but it publishing was moving away from that grim dark kind of gritty fantasy more towards cozy romantasy, and also there was obviously a really strong focus on diverse authors and underrepresented authors, and quite rightly, because obviously fantasy had been so white male dominated for so many years, so inevitably there needed to be some readjustment there. But obviously none of that really helped me when I'm going out with kind of like, as a white man going out with a kind of a gritty fantasy, is like, wasn't necessarily I think what people were looking for. But we spent kind of 18 months in the submission trenches, and had kind of one or two kind of, there was 1 or 2 moments when it looked like something was going to happen. There seemed to be some really strong interest, and if for whatever reason it just sort of fizzled out. But it's tough, and that was, it was a really tough experience. But I'm really grateful for it now, because as an editor, it gave me a first-hand experience of what it is like for authors
Yes.
to go through this emotional grind of being on submission, like the weeks and weeks going by and nothing happens, and suddenly there's an expression of interest, and can we have more time to consider? And you're starting to think, okay, here we go, this is this, and then nothing, it doesn't go anywhere. And there's highs and lows and constant up and down, and
Mm.
being in that position, and being in that emotional state for 18 months is extremely draining, and so that was a really valuable experience for me. I hated it at the time because it sucked,
Oh
obviously,
yeah.
but
It's
now I
tough.
look back and I'm like, I'm glad that happened, because it made me a more empathetic editor, because I understood what it is like to pour your heart and soul into a book and put it out there, and no one to really give a toss about it. Like, it's pretty hard to take,
Yep.
and
Brutal.
it is brutal, yeah, and but that was a really valuable experience for me to kind of learn that, and I'm also glad that I did it as well, because I feel like when everything did work out later, I felt like I had earned it. I felt like it didn't just fall into my lap. Getting an agent was something that kind of just fell straight into my lap, and I was incredibly fortunate. But in a way, the eventual publishing deal kind of didn't, and we had to kind of go through that long phase of rejection. And we got loads of rejections, and they started off being kind of like, this is really good, but it's just not really what we want right now. And so at first you're kind of thinking, oh, that's all right, they liked it, they didn't really quite fancy it. So at first when you're getting these, you're thinking, this is good, someone's surely going to go for it. By the time you've got a dozen rejections that all kind of say the same thing, this is really good, it's just not really what we want, it becomes frustrating, because you realize the problem isn't the quality of the book, it's just the moment in that
Timing.
landscape. It's the timing isn't right. If
Mm.
we'd gone out a bit earlier, it probably would have been, if we'd gone out a couple of years earlier, I think it would have been a completely different story. But it wasn't. We were in the moment we were in, and at that moment no one wanted this kind of thing. And that's quite hard as a writer to feel like you've written something that is really good. And by this point I was convinced it was good, because everyone was, all of these editors were telling me it was good. So I was pretty sure the book was a good book, but it wasn't what they wanted, and that's frustrating, because there's nothing you can do about that. If everyone was coming
No.
back and going, sorry, your book sucks, well, obviously that's really disappointing, but at least that there's something you can work on. You're like, okay,
I can
it's not
fix it.
I can
Yeah.
become a better writer, and maybe next time it'll be different. Whereas with everyone telling you your book's really good, but we don't want it anyway, what are you supposed to do with that as a writer? Like, there's not really anything you can do. And I wouldn't just want to go away and be like, oh well, I'll write something that maybe they will want then, because that would mean writing in a subgenre that just isn't really of interest to me as a writer. I don't want
Yeah.
to, and I probably would do a really bad job of it, because it's just not for me. I'm not familiar with it, and so yeah, so after 18 months, it looked like it was was clear we kind of run out of options. And at that point, so I had a meeting with Anne, and she kind of said to me, look, there's two things that you can do here. Well, there's three things you can do. You can write something else, which I just immediately was like, no, I just can't. I mentally, I just can't. After 7 years in
After
this
that
kind
much
of,
time.
after 7 years in this world with this book, I just can't walk away from it. And also, I know it's a good book, so that makes it doubly harder to put it aside. So I know it's good enough. So I just immediately ruled that out. So there's really only two things we could do, and one of them was to turn it into a YA book and see if we could sub it around YA editors, which was a really good suggestion. But like, I don't read YA, I don't edit
Nope.
YA.
No.
I just wouldn't know where to start doing that. And
Yeah.
it would just feel like I was turning it into something that it wasn't. It's a story for adults, whatever that means. And so I just thought, I don't know where to even begin with that. And and also having gone over it 11, 12 times, I haven't got the stomach for doing more kind of deconstructing it again. And just the thought of that is immediately like, I just can't do it. So the other option was to self-publish, which was not really something I'd thought about. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, actually, given that I'm an editor in the industry, I know how to write copy, I know how to brief a cover, I know kind of how to write marketing spiel and all that kind of stuff. So I thought, actually, you know what, there's obviously a lot to learn. There's a huge amount to learn about self-publishing, but I feel like I can make a go of this. And really, if anyone could do well, it should be someone in my position who already has that grounding in publishing. So I thought, I feel like pretty well placed to have a crack at this. So that was what I was going to do, and I started researching self-publishing. I found a cover designer and briefed the cover, and that cover is the same one that you see on the finished book now, because fortunately my publishers really liked it, so we kept it, which I'm glad about because it cost me a hell of a lot of money. So I was quite happy to get that back.
Yep, thanks for that.
But yeah, so went quite far down the route of self-publishing it, and yeah, and then just got a call from Anne one day, and she basically said, yeah, so I'm afraid I can't be your agent anymore. And so I was just thinking, oh, that's great. Like, 18 months in the submission trenches, being rejected by everyone under the sun, and now my agent's ditched me. So you're like, cool, well, this is going really well. I'm really happy this has happened to me. But then the next beat, Anne said, the reason I can't be your agent anymore is because I'm joining Quercus to head up the science fiction and fantasy imprint, and I really want to acquire your book as one of my first titles. Because I was still in shock, but mostly because I'm an idiot, I just kind of said, oh, well, I don't know, I'll have to think about it, and just like sort of hung up. And then I did think about it for all of about 10 seconds. And then, and then I was like, what am I thinking about? I literally, this is a book offer, like, so I was like, okay.
Now you're right.
Yeah. So
Well,
that thing you've always wanted for 20 years. Actually, I'm fine. I don't want it. So I should have immediately phoned Anne back and said, I'm being an idiot. Yes, I would very much like to be published by you. But of course I didn't, because I'm British and that'd be embarrassing. So I waited 2 weeks and then told her husband at a barbecue. I was like, actually, I'm seriously considering your wife's offer. So, yeah, I know. which is definitely not how it normally works in publishing. We don't do clandestine deals at barbecues and stuff like some sort of literary mafia. But yeah. So I mean, that was obviously a massive chunk of good fortune. Like I can't think of any other authors whose agent became an editor and bought their book. It's kind of like, in terms of routes into becoming an author, it's kind of it's a pretty unique one. Like as I've said elsewhere, if this was a role-playing game and you get the different kind of, all the weapons have the different colors depending on how rare they are, this would be like gold kind of relic status kind of route into publishing. It's a pretty unusual one, and I was I mean, again, it's just a huge amount of good fortune, and as we've talked about earlier, it's one of those things just lining up, something just really right time, right place. It just, things worked out in the perfect way. And so it was quite tough, because that was sort of like summer 22, and it wasn't until the autumn that Anne even joined Quercus and Joe Fletcher, as it was called then. It's obviously called Arcadia now, but so I had to wait sort of several months for Anne to join, and then it was a few more months before she was in a position to actually be able to kind of take the book to acquisitions and so on and so forth. And even then, at that point, it's not 100% done. Like, I was fairly confident that Anne would be able to get it through acquisitions and stuff, but you never know. Like, there's always someone that might be like, oh, I'm not feeling it. Like, you never know. So, but we did get there in the end, and in the end, Anne did acquire it. And what was really wild was then we went out on submission again in the US with it a few months later, and it ended up going to auction and Tor ended up buying it, which is kind of wild because these publishers had sort of had it previously and no one had wanted it, you know, and all of a
Yeah.
sudden, a year later, all of a sudden you've got more than one actually wanting it and they're sort of fighting over it, which is just, it's to, you know, to be in that position, given where we'd been a year earlier, was just completely crazy. But it just goes to show again, it's all about timing. It's
Timing.
timing
Yeah.
and things lining up. Having a totally different experience just 12 months apart. I suppose it was a bit different the second time round because there was already a UK publisher, and I think that makes a big difference when the US,
Yes.
when you know there is already a publisher in the other market that's going to be pushing it. We also had a cover as well, you know. I think we were able to present like a much more fuller package the second time round, and for an editor who's, you know, looking at that and thinking there's already a publisher in the UK, there's already a cover, it already feels like quite a concrete proposition. That's different to just getting a manuscript in on the agent slush pile and just, you know, it's a different proposition. It's a completely different dynamic, I guess. So
But even
um
then, it doesn't always happen. Like
no, it doesn't, of course it
Hannah
doesn't.
Kaner
Yeah,
had her UK deal. She didn't have a US deal. The book came out, and then like I think it was 4 or 5 months later, US. Then the US bought it. So
yeah,
her
yeah,
book's actually out, and no one's. And
yeah,
when the US is
yeah.
like, "How do we read it? Hello?" And then suddenly she gets a deal after the fact. So we were
Yeah,
lucky in some ways that it still went
it's
across.
wild, isn't it? It's crazy. So much of it is about timing. But you know, so I mean that it was a really strange kind of roundabout route to actually getting the book published. But you know,
Mm.
since then it's obviously been really great. And obviously it came out last week in the UK, it comes out next week in the US, and so it's all happening. But yeah, it's been I don't know. I mean, this is what you dream of, isn't it? When I sat down to write a book like at the age of 15 or 16, this is what you dream of. It coming out, people reading it, people enjoying it. And I remember I was speaking to my brother a while ago, and this was kind of back when, you know, I was waiting for Anne to be able to join Quercus to be able to kind of like try and acquire the book. And I was talking to my brother, and and he kind of said to me, what would success look like to you? And I remember I kind of said to him, I just want people to read the book and enjoy it. That's really where the bar is for me. Like the dream has always just been to be able to hold the book, to be able to walk into Waterstones and see it on the shelf, and you know, to have some people, it doesn't even really matter how many it is, just have some people read it and actually be like, yeah, that was great, I really enjoyed it. That's where the bar was at for me. I wasn't thinking about anything beyond that, but already I feel like I've been really fortunate to just enjoy so much more than that. You know, like we had the Broken Binding edition, which was just
Mm.
stunning with the illustrations, and like, you know, just to be able to look at your book in that kind of edition with the illustrations and everything. And that's kind of a real author's dream, to have an edition as beautiful as
Oh
that, you
yeah,
know. And
yeah.
as it's, you know, so we had that, and I got the Scott Lynch quote, which was amazing because I'm a huge fan of Scott's. And you know, I think getting that quote through, to know that he read my book and actually enjoyed it enough to give a quote for it, was, I mean, I think my spirit momentarily left my body. It was just like,
Yeah.
Craig, you know,
You can't top it.
no, you can't. And you know, and so to have had these moments when just 2 years before we were in the kind of submission trenches with just so many rejections piling up, like it's been a crazy kind of 2 years since then. Like you just couldn't really have asked for more. So I've been incredibly fortunate, really, and just, you know, so it's really nice to now be here and to feel like, yes, I have obviously been very lucky in the way many things have worked out, but at the same time, I know I've grafted for this really hard, not just over the last 6 or 7 years, but also since I was 14 or 15. You know, and I really like to believe that in the end, hard work and perseverance really does pay off. You know, so I like to
Yeah.
think anyway, because that's all you can really do, isn't it? It's all you can do is just keep going, keep working, try
I
to
did.
improve. Yeah, yeah,
But for years and years, I know I sent books on submission and got rejected and rejected until I, got
yeah,
my first book out and debuted. So,
yeah.
um, so tell people about Silverblood Promise. Tell people about Lucan and Flea and the world that you built. Because we touched on world building. So tell us a bit about the world that it's set in.
Yeah, so the world is kind of it's the closest sort of real world comparison really. It's kind of Renaissance era really in terms of real
Mm.
world, and Yeah, I mean, the book is set on a continent called the Old Empire, and it's not the only continent in the world, but it's the one that the book is set in, and it's quite varied in terms of geography. And like Sophrona, where the book is set, is on the southern tip, and it's kind of very much influenced by sort of places in Spain like Seville, with that kind of North African influence on the architecture, because obviously you had the Moors and the Middle Ages come over and take over parts of Spain before they were eventually beaten back. So, but they left their influence very much on the architecture and things like that. So I mean, I'm being really influenced. If you go to like the palace in Seville, you can still see all of the kind of the architecture, the Arabic influence on the architecture, and it's really
Mm.
beautiful. And so you had this really interesting kind of like combination of like European architecture meeting kind of North African Arabic kind of influence, and I found that really interesting. Something about that just stuck in my head, and so Sophrona was really kind of influenced by that mixing of cultures, but also with a bit of just like Byzantine kind of Constantinople sort of thrown in as well. Had the idea of Sophrona very early on being this kind of gateway between two continents, kind of northern continent and the southern continent, the same way that Constantinople was like a gateway between east and west in the sort of Middle Ages and the
Mm.
kind of late Roman Empire. That confluence of like cultures meeting and becoming a melting pot of culture. That was kind of the starting point for Sophrona, but the wider when I was world building, in those coffee shops all those years ago, I had the idea that the kind of the starting point for the series actually was I decided I wanted to write a series where each book took place in a different setting, like a different city, because I
Mm.
felt that would get not only would it be interesting for me as a writer to be able to explore different settings, but I also felt it would keep the reader interested.
Yeah.
I didn't want to get bored writing the same setting over and over again. I remember talking to Mark Sharon Newton actually many years ago because he's a very good friend of mine, and
Mm.
he obviously wrote the Legends of the Red Sun series, which is I think is
Yep.
brilliant, kind of Dying Earth series, which probably doesn't get the attention it deserves these days. But I remember talking to him about it, and obviously that's set in like kind of like an encroaching ice age on like a tundra, and I remember speaking to him about it. I think around the time of him writing the fourth book, and he was just like, "Man, I'm just so bored of describing snow. I mean, there's only so way." And it kind of ignores the fact that I think the Inuit or whoever have like 80 different words for it. So I mean, there's
Yeah.
lots of different ways you can explain describe it. But no, obviously know what he means. Like writing that kind of landscape for 4 books, I think you probably do get to the point where you're just like, oh boy, I really wish I could write
You
something.
want to stretch different muscles, and
You
for those
kind of do,
different
yeah.
locations helps.
Exactly, yeah. So I kind of thought, what if I write a book where it follows the same character, but each book is set in a different place, so to keep it interesting. So that was really the starting point. And then after that, it was very much just a case of kind of figuring out sort of the world. So I did that. I did the whole coffee shop thing and figured out that like what are these different cities and what makes them unique. And so obviously Sophrona is like city of merchant princes, of trade, kind of confluence of cultures coming together. And then the second book is set in Kozlakov in the far north, so it's kind of much more Eastern European, Russian kind of influence in terms of real world,
Mm.
and the focus there is kind of innovation and technology and alchemy. So that's what makes that city that's what that city is renowned for. And then Lucan's own city of Parva, his home city, is kind of the cultural sort of hub of the old empire. So that's kind of there. It's renowned for like its plays and musicals and like wine and cuisine and all that kind of stuff. So it was about kind of giving each city its own identifier and characteristics. And once you've got that locked down, then you can then build the story around it, I suppose. So I kind of so the world is very much kind of, I suppose you would say the old empire is mostly sort of European Renaissance kind of thing, but there's also other cultures and continents within the world that obviously lean into completely different sort of cultures as well. And we see a little bit of that in the first book when the Zargosans come over, and that's much more sort of North African influenced in terms of their own culture, which that was really fun to kind of include them. Obviously, really stretching for representation in this book and diversity was something I thought about a lot while I was writing it. And yeah, the unconscious bias is a real interesting thing because I kind of like at the end of the first draft, I just sort of read it back and I was like, wow, like every character of importance is a man. Like, and it's amazing how you just slip into that mode. And so I had to consciously be like, right, I need to actually readdress the balance here. I need to have far more women in roles of power and authority and make it like much more balanced. And I actually saw an Amazon review randomly yesterday that someone actually commented and said, just commented on the fact that there are so many like powerful women of authority in this book and how refreshing it was to read that. And I was really happy about that because I had worked so hard to kind of address that balance and make sure there
Mm.
was representation and all that. And so that was a nice moment. But Yeah, that was kind of the starting point of the world, was that kind of European Renaissance kind of era, because I think there's so much more you can do with that. And this is what Scott Lynch found out, I think, when he was kind of creating his own world. Obviously, I think he realized that Lies a Lot More, or the book that became it, was originally set in kind of like medieval dirt town kind of thing. And I think he realized at one point, he was like, I've got these characters that are doing these complex heists, but I don't have the monetary systems or the institutions for actually them to be able to do it. Because how do you rob a bank when you don't actually have banking? Well, you can't. So he then realized he needed to like jump forward kind of 300 years or so in real world terms, and have a much more kind of developed economy with all of these financial institutions and all of that, because that's what he needed to make the story work. So I think the same was kind of true for me. I knew the kind of story that I wanted to tell, which would lean quite heavily into similar kind of heisty sort of things, would need these structures and these societal kind of structures. So
Mm.
that's kind of where that came from. And then the characters themselves have just were knocking around in my head for a long time. Lucan has been in there for decades, and he's assumed various guises over the years and has appeared in various kind of previous drafts. But I think this time I finally found his character, the kind of laconic, kind of sarcastic, lapsed nobleman who likes gambling, just generally getting into trouble, but who, you know, does have a moral compass and is a good person deep down, despite being quite troubled and broken at times. That's finally, I found for him the character that worked. And then Flea, and that was another one that's been in my head for a long time. And I gender flipped her actually, because she was originally a boy called Rat, but I just suddenly figured actually the dynamic between them is so much more interesting if it's a little girl and an older man, and the way she bosses him around and stuff. That suddenly just felt so much more appealing. So, and I kind of knew that I felt like their bantery relationship would be the heart of the novel somehow. And so it kind of was a lot of it was constructed around that. And I still feel even now that's kind of, even though it's Lucan's story, I feel the heart of it is really their relationship, and how that will play out over the coming books. I have no idea how it play out. I'm kind of making it up as I go. So we'll see how that, check in 2 or 3 years to see whether I've actually made a complete mess of it. But I've got some ideas for how it might play out. But no, I mean, the book itself is essentially is my love letter to kind of adventure fantasy. I've always kind of loved the hero's journey that you get in kind of like classical high epic fantasy, but it's always been the kind of gritty, seedy environments that you often find in kind of low fantasy and sword and sorcery that has always just held more appeal for me for some reason. And I really enjoy kind of city-based adventures because there's just so much you can do with them, and you have, yeah, and a lot of it in like bigger things like Game of Thrones, for example. And I think this is something they really struggled with in the later series of the TV show. It's so vast, and it's realizing that a character is over here but needs to be over here, and then, you know, that's why you ended up with all the teleporting going on in the final
Yes.
season. It just felt like people were
Yeah,
popping
yeah.
up everywhere because it's such a vast canvas, whereas when you've got a really much narrower canvas that you're much more limited scope, narrower canvas that you're working in, it just means the pacing is much better because everything is closer together. You don't have to be like, oh wow, I've got to come up with a whole chapter of showing this character traveling from one place to another, which is what you get sometimes in these big sprawling epics, because you have to do that. Whereas with this kind of adventure story, you can dispense with that because there's no need for it. And I think it really, one of the things that readers seem to have really connected with, which I'm really happy about, is the pacing of the book. And like,
Right.
I wanted to write something that was a real page turner, kind of like a romp. I mean, you know, I'm not pretending it's something that it's not. It's not meant to be kind of a big, sophisticated, complex thing. It's kind of fantasy Indiana Jones, which I've seen people calling it, and I quite like, because actually
Okay.
it
Yeah.
kind of is like, it's, you know, it's fantasy Indiana Jones. It's a romp. It's an adventure. There's sword fights, and there's, you know, narrow escapes and magic and monsters and weird, wonderful artifacts, and, you know, lots of banter. And it's basically Last Crusade, but in kind of Renaissance kind of Europe influenced kind of world. You know, it's not a million miles away from that kind of thing. And because I love that, I love adventure stories. And I think one of the things that all the books I had in common that I was reading when I was younger, the one thing they have in common, regardless of what genre they were, was that they were adventure stories. And there's something about that, I think, that I think actually, I remember reading Terry Brooks and George Lucas, because Terry wrote the Phantom Menace tie-in novel, so he got to meet George Lucas and stuff. And I remember him talking about it, and he said that one of the things they had in common was that they both thought of themselves, in terms of storytellers, they both thought of themselves first and foremost as like adventure enthusiasts. You know, they
Mm.
they love adventure. Like, you know, George Lucas was obviously doing Star Wars, which is like science fantasy or whatever. Terry Brooks is writing very much kind of the Tolkien tradition of epic fantasy. But the one thing they both have in common is they love adventure stories, and they are both of those things are adventure stories, just in slightly different with slightly different execution and slightly
Yeah.
different worlds.
Yeah.
But is that adventure story thing is the heart of it, and I think that's was very much what I wanted to capture with this. I wanted to write something that was fast paced, exciting, full of action, but also had a lot of heart and also just some cool world building. So the focus was always there, very much a character driven thing with cool things around the edges, and that was. But it was really my love letter to kind of just fantasy adventure. So that's what I was trying to do, and I think the advice of trying to write something that you like to read, I think is really not it's not so much write what you know, it's more like write what you like write this kind of thing that you know you would enjoy reading. And if you do that, I don't think you can go far wrong, in all honesty. So that's what I thought I would try and do, and I feel like I've sort of achieved that for the most part.
Yeah, it's the adventure when people say, who are you writing for? Who's your audience? Your audience is initially me. Like, what cool story would I want to read?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
writing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's how you. It also stops you from getting bored with your own work, because if you're writing the kind of thing you enjoy reading, you're not going to get bored with it. Whereas I think if the dangers of like trying to write to the market and trying to write to something that maybe is
yeah,
not really your kind of thing, it's like, yeah, you might give yourself more chance when you're going out on submission, but like if you don't really know what you're doing and your heart's not really in it, is the work you're producing actually good?
yeah.
Like
If you're chasing a
that's the thing.
wave as opposed to creating one because you've done something so new, everyone
Yeah,
races to copy you now.
yeah, well, this is the thing. And I think ultimately, I think publishing, one thing I've learned from being in publishing for the better part of 15 years is that everything moves in cycles.
Yeah.
Things will come around again. At the moment, so Grimdark has kind of had its moment. The focus is elsewhere at the moment. But at some point, readers will start coming back to stories that maybe have higher stakes or maybe a little bit harder edged. Everything moves in cycles. And so, I think you've just got to stick to what you know, like what you enjoy and what you think you can actually write effectively and write well, and just trust that if it's good enough, the readers will come to you anyway, regardless of whether it's the hot new thing or whatever. So yeah, exactly.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up there then. I think that's good
Mm,
advice. Write what you love, definitely, not what what you think you should be writing. So
absolutely. And the other things we discussed earlier, finish what you start. I think
always,
those
yeah,
those two things. I think those are the two things that I would say to and also maybe the third one, just figure out what works for you. Because I did that thing like of write 1,000 words every day or whatever. Well, I did that and I burned out instantly. It's not for me. And
yeah,
maybe it
no,
works for some people, but it's not for me. So it's about also finding out what works for you and what doesn't, because ultimately everyone's different. Everyone has their own process, and once you've figured yours out, you become much quicker and better at writing, I think. So yeah.
definitely, definitely. Right. Well, the Silverblood Promise is out now. By the time this video comes out, it will be almost all out in the US as well, so people can pick it up. I'll put links down below. People can find you online. But I'll see you at Worldcon later this year.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Brilliant. Thanks very
All
much for
right.
having me.
All right, everyone. We'll say goodnight then. Good night.